May 3, 1940. Stunning France. The French Char B1 heavy tank sat abandoned in a field, its 47 tons of armor, scarred by 17 direct German hits, that barely scratched the paint. The crew had walked away not because it was destroyed, but because they'd run out of fuel. Lieutenant James Wickham stood beside this indestructible monster and had an impossible idea. What if you took a tank nothing could kill and gave it a weapon that fired 200 rounds per minute? What the British engineers created in a desperate French barn would terrify German pilots, break Italian fortifications, and hold the line at Tobruk when everything else was falling apart. The Germans would call them devil tanks. This is their story. May 3, 1940. Stone, France. The Char B1 sat in the field like a cathedral made of steel, its 47 tons of armor plate catching the early light. Lieutenant James Wickham walked the perimeter slowly, his boots crushing the spent brass casings that littered the ground like copper flowers. The tank had taken 17 direct hits. 17. He could see where the German 37mm rounds had bounced off the frontal armor, leaving nothing but scratches and dents. The French crew had abandoned it, not because it was destroyed, but because they'd run out of fuel. Wickham placed his hand against the cold metal. The armor was 60mm thick on the front, 40 on the sides. He'd never seen anything like it. Back in England, their Matilda II tanks were considered heavy at 27 tons. This French monster was nearly double that weight. The 75mm gun in the hull pointed forward like an accusing finger. Above it, the 47mm gun in the turret swept the empty horizon. Two main guns on a single tank. The Germans had nothing that could match it, not in armor, not in firepower. Yet France was falling. Wickham climbed onto the deck, peering through the commander's cupola. The interior smelled of cordite and sweat and fear. Empty shell casings rolled across the floor. The radio was still on, crackling with static. Someone had left a photograph wedged into a vision slit. A woman and two children, smiling in the sunshine. He picked up the crew logbook from the floor. The last entry was dated 2 days ago, written in hurried French script. He could make out enough to understand. They'd been in continuous combat for 72 hours. They'd destroyed 6 Panzer IIIs, 4 Panzer IVs, and lost count of the lighter vehicles. They'd held a crossroads against an entire German battalion. Then the fuel gauge hit empty, and they'd walked away from the most powerful tank in Europe. Wickham descended from the hull and circled to the rear. The engine compartment was enormous, housing a 107 horsepower inline-six. Beautiful engineering. Waste. The Germans were less than 50 kilometers away now, moving fast through the Ardennes, and here sat dozens of these monsters, abandoned across the French countryside because the supply lines had collapsed. He pulled out his notebook and began sketching. The War Office had sent him here to evaluate captured equipment, to see what could be salvaged, what could be learned. But as he drew the lines of the Char B1's hull, another idea was forming. What if they didn't just study these tanks? What if they used? The sound of truck engines made him look up. A convoy was approaching. British Army Service Corps markings on the canvas sides. Captain Morrison climbed down from the lead vehicle, a cigarette dangling from his lips. Found another one. Have you? Morrison walked around the tank with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent 20 years around armor. French built these things like they were planning to fight the last war, all over again, slow as molasses, drinks fuel like a drunk sailor drinks whiskey. But nothing can kill it, Wickham said. Morrison flicked ash onto the ground. Doesn't matter if you can't keep it running. Germans are faster, more mobile. They don't need to kill these monsters. They just drive around them and cut off the fuel trucks. What if we could fix that? Fix what? The whole bloody French army's logistics system. No, Wickham tapped his notebook. What if we could make these tanks useful, really useful? Morrison squinted at him through the smoke. You've been out in the sun too long, Lieutenant. But Wickham wasn't listening. He was looking at the turret ring, calculating. The French had mounted a 47mm gun up there, designed for anti-tank work. But the turret was large, spacious, even by British standards. Room for a bigger crew, room for a different weapon. Back home in England, they just started receiving shipments of Swedish Bofors guns, 40mm anti-aircraft weapons that could fire 120 rounds per minute. Everyone was mounting them on trucks and naval vessels and static positions around the cities, waiting for the Luftwaffe. But what if you mounted one on the most heavily armored vehicle in existence? What if you took a tank that nothing could kill and gave it a weapon that could shred anything that flew, anything that moved, anything that dared come within 2,000 meters? Morrison was staring at him now. What are you thinking? Wickham turned to face him, and the morning light caught the insignia on his collar: Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, problem solvers, fixers. I'm thinking, Wickham said slowly, that we're about to make the Germans very, very nervous. The convoy had brought welding equipment, cutting torches, spare parts salvaged from a dozen different vehicles. Wickham's team had been following the British Expeditionary Forces retreat, cataloguing abandoned French equipment, marking locations for potential recovery. Now they had a different mission. Morrison called over his sergeant, a thick-necked Welshman named Davies, who looked like he could bend steel with his bare hands. Get the lads unloaded. Apparently we're in the tank modification business now. Davies looked at the Char B1, then at Wickham, then back at the tank. Sir, with respect, that's a French heavy tank. I'm aware, Sergeant. We don't have parts for French heavy tanks. We're not repairing it, Wickham said. We're improving it. He opened his notebook and showed them the sketch. The Bofors gun, mounted where the 47mm currently sat. The autoloader system, adapted to fit the turret ring. Ammunition bins repositioned for continuous feed. Morrison whistled low. That's either brilliant or completely insane. Could be both, Wickham agreed. Davies was nodding slowly. The way engineers do when they see a problem they want to solve. We'd need to reinforce the turret ring. The Bofors has a hell of a recoil. The French over-engineered everything. The structure can take it. And the ammunition. Where do we store 40mm clips in a tank designed for shells? We remove the 75mm ammunition. The whole gun stays, but we make it secondary. The Bofors becomes the primary weapon. Morrison dropped his cigarette and ground it under his boot. The French will have our heads for this. The French, Wickham said quietly, are currently evacuating Paris. Nobody argued with that. Davies was already calling orders to his men, unloading equipment, setting up a perimeter. Within an hour, the field had transformed into an impromptu workshop. Cutting torches hit, welding sparks showered down like fireflies. The turret of the Char B1 began coming apart, piece by careful piece.
Bovington Camp, Dorset. 3 months after Dunkirk, the heavy assault tank group had grown from one experimental vehicle to 16 operational Devil tanks, with more being converted every week, as the remaining Char B1s were recovered from France or salvaged from units that had made it to England. Wickham stood in the observation bunker watching Tank Alpha 4 complete its live-fire demonstration, the Bofors hammering away at target drones being flown by remote control. The gun performed flawlessly, destroying 3 drones in rapid succession at ranges between 800 and 1500 meters. In the bunker with him were 24 observers, British Army officers, Royal Air Force liaisons, representatives from the Ministry of Supply, even an American colonel who'd flown over specifically to see the Devil tanks in action. The American, a man named Patterson, with Texas in his voice and skepticism in his eyes, watched through binoculars as the 4th drone exploded. That's impressive, he admitted grudgingly, but it's still a French tank, slow, heavy, breaks down constantly. How do you keep them running? We don't, Wickham said. We've stripped out the original French engines and replaced them with Liberty engines from American tank production, 420 horsepower, reliable, easier to maintain. We've upgraded the transmissions, reinforced the suspensions, improved the fuel systems. The only original French components are the armor and the hull structure. Patterson lowered his binoculars. You've basically rebuilt them. Yes, it takes 6 weeks per tank, but the result is a vehicle that's mechanically reliable and tactically devastating. And the Bofors gun, how many rounds can it sustain? The gun itself can fire continuously for several minutes before overheating. We typically fire in bursts of 10 to 20 rounds to manage heat and conserve ammunition. Total ammunition capacity is 256 rounds, which provides approximately 90 seconds of continuous fire or 15 to 20 minutes of sustained combat. With proper fire discipline,
Patterson was nodding now, his skepticism fading. What's the armor penetration resistance? 60 mm frontal armor can defeat any current German tank gun at combat ranges. The German 37 mm gun is ineffective. The 50 mm short barrel gun can penetrate the side armor at close range, but struggles with the frontal armor. Even the long 75 mm guns have difficulty with frontal shots beyond 500 meters. So it's essentially immune to current German armor. Not immune, but highly resistant. The real value isn't just surviving hits, it's the psychological effect. German tank crews have learned that engaging a devil tank is suicide. They avoid contact when possible. The demonstration continued for another hour. They showed mobility drills, formation tactics, combined arms operations with infantry support. They demonstrated the tank's ability to engage ground targets with the hull-mounted 75 mm gun, while simultaneously engaging aircraft with the turret Bofors. They showed reliability by running all 16 tanks continuously for 4 hours without a single mechanical failure. When it ended, Patterson pulled Wickham aside. "My government is interested," he said quietly. "Very interested. We're starting our own tank production, and we're looking at designs. This concept, mounting dedicated anti-aircraft armament on a heavy tank, it's revolutionary. The concept only works because the Char B1 has the armor to survive. Most tanks are too lightly protected to justify the modification. But what if you designed a tank from scratch with this mission in mind? Heavy armor, powerful anti-aircraft gun, purpose-built for the role." Wickham hadn't thought that far ahead. He'd been so focused on making the devil tanks work that he hadn't considered the next generation. "That would be expensive," he said. "War is expensive. Losing is more expensive." Patterson pulled out a card, handed it to Wickham. "When this war is over, if you're interested in consulting work, contact me. The US Army would benefit from your experience." Wickham pocketed the card, knowing he'd probably never use it, but appreciating the gesture. The war was far from over. They still had work to do. The next development came from an unexpected source. A young tank commander named Harris approached Wickham after a training exercise, his face excited. "Sir, I've been thinking about the Bofors mount. Currently we can only engage targets in the upper hemisphere, aircraft and elevated positions. But what if we could depress the gun enough to engage ground targets? The Bofors wasn't designed for direct fire." "No sir, but it doesn't know that. The gun can fire at 0 degrees elevation. The limitation is the tank turret, not the weapon. If we modified the mount to allow more depression, we could use the Bofors against infantry, light vehicles, fortifications." Wickham considered. The Bofors fired 40 mm high explosive shells at 200 rounds per minute against infantry in the open, against thin-skinned vehicles, against building walls. That rate of fire would be devastating. "Show me." They spent a week modifying Tank Alpha 7, adjusting the mount to allow the Bofors to depress 10 degrees below horizontal. The modification reduced maximum elevation, but dramatically increased ground engagement capability. The first test was against a simulated German infantry position, wooden targets arranged in trenches and behind sandbags. Harris traversed the turret, depressed the gun, fired. The Bofors shells tore through the position like a hurricane, destroying every target in 15 seconds. Wood splinters flew, sandbags exploded, nothing survived. Wickham watched through binoculars, his mind racing through the implications. They'd created the devil tanks to provide mobile anti-aircraft defense, but what they'd actually created was a multi-role weapons platform that could engage anything: aircraft, armor, infantry, fortification. The Bofors gun, with its high rate of fire and powerful ammunition, was effective against every target type except the heaviest tanks, and even against heavy tanks, 200 rounds per minute, hitting the same spot would eventually penetrate anything. He called a meeting of all the tank commanders that evening, 16 men, sitting in a classroom at Bofors, exhausted from training, but alert. "We've been thinking about the devil tanks wrong," Wickham said without preamble. "We designed them as anti-aircraft platforms, but the Bofors gun is effective against almost everything. Aircraft, yes, but also light armor, infantry, structures. We need to rethink our tactics, our training, our deployment doctrine. These aren't specialized anti-aircraft tanks.
Their universal fire support vehicles. Silence in the room, as the commanders processed that. Finally, Morrison spoke up. If we're engaging ground targets, we'll burn through ammunition fast. 256 rounds sounds like a lot until you're firing at 200 rounds per minute. Then we need to improve ammunition logistics, dedicated supply vehicles, faster reload procedures, maybe even redesign the ammunition storage to carry more rounds, and we need better coordination with infantry. Harris added, if we're supporting ground attacks, we need to train with the infantry units, develop communications procedures, practice combined arms tactics. Wickham nodded. Agreed. Starting tomorrow, we're implementing a new training program. Every Devil tank crew will train on both air defense and ground support missions. Every crew will practice coordinating with infantry, artillery, and other armored units. We're going to become the most versatile tank unit in the British Army. The training intensified. 16 tanks running constant exercises, day and night, pushing crews and vehicles to their limits. They practiced engaging aircraft while under artillery fire. They practiced supporting infantry assaults while defending against counterattack. They practiced night operations, urban combat, river crossings. By October 1940, the heavy assault tank group was ready for deployment. 16 Devil tanks, fully crewed, fully supplied, tactically proficient in every scenario they could imagine. Wickham received orders on October 5. North Africa, the Western Desert Force needed heavy armor support. German forces under Rommel were pushing toward Egypt. The Devil tanks were going to.
The work took 6 days. 6 days of cutting, welding, measuring, cursing, and improvising solutions that no engineering manual had ever considered. They'd moved the Char B1 into an abandoned barn outside Arras, working through the nights by the light of electric lamps powered by a portable generator that coughed and sputtered like it had lung disease. Wickham barely slept. He spent his time bent over drawings, making calculations, checking clearances with calipers and measuring tapes until the numbers blurred together. The Bofors gun arrived on the 3rd day, shipped up from a coastal defense position that no longer needed defending because the coast itself was about to fall. It came in pieces, carefully packed in wooden crates marked with Swedish text and British inventory numbers. Davies and his team lifted it with a chain hoist, the barrel gleaming with Cosmoline preservative. The gun weighed over 600 kilograms without its carriage. Getting it to fit inside a French tank turret designed for a completely different weapon system was like trying to fit a cathedral organ into a telephone booth. They had to remove the original gun mantlet entirely, fabricate a new one from steel plate salvaged from a wrecked Matilda tank. The French had used bolted construction for easy field repair. The British team welded everything, making it permanent, making it stronger. The turret ring had to be reinforced with additional steel bands, hand-fitted and welded into place. Davies worked the acetylene torch himself, the blue flame turning metal into liquid light. He'd been an apprentice at a Sheffield steel mill before the war, knew metal like other men knew women. When he declared a weld good, it was good. The ammunition feed system was the hardest part. The Bofors used 4-round clips that loaded from the top. The French Turch had been designed for single shell loading through a breech. Wickham designed a modified hopper system that could hold 16 clips, 64 rounds ready to fire without reloading. They mounted it where the original radio equipment had been, running the feed mechanism through a series of guides and rails that let the loader drop clips in continuously, without stopping. Morrison brought the first test clip on the morning of the 5th day. He handed it to Wickham, like it was made of nitroglycerin, 4 brass shells, each one as long as a man's forearm, gleaming in the lamplight. High explosive rounds designed to tear aircraft apart. Wickham slid the clip into the feed mechanism. It locked into place with a satisfying click. He worked the loading handle. The mechanism stripped the first round, chambered it smoothly, ejected the clip. Perfect. Again, he said. They ran it 50 times, loading and unloading, checking for jams, measuring clearances, adjusting spring tensions. The mechanism worked every single time. Davies was grinning. Bloody hell, sir. It actually works. But working in a barn was different from working in combat. They needed to test it under load, under recoil, under the conditions that would either prove the concept or tear the whole thing apart.
They rolled the Char B1 out of the barn on the 6th morning. Someone had found French fuel, 50 jerry cans of it, enough to run the tank for maybe 8 hours of operation, enough for a test. Wickham climbed into the commander's position. The turret was cramped now, more cramped than before. The Bofors dominated the interior space, its receiver and barrel taking up most of the available volume. The loader's position was awkward, requiring him to crouch and twist to access the ammunition hopper, but it would work. It had to work. Morrison took the driver's seat. He'd driven Matildas in training, figured a French tank couldn't be that different. He was wrong. The Char B1 had a 75mm gun in the hull that aimed by steering the entire tank. It had a complicated hydrostatic transmission that required constant attention. It had more gauges and levers than any British tank, all of them labeled in French. It took him 20 minutes just to get it started. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life with a deep bass rumble that made the ground shake. Black smoke belched from the exhaust. The whole tank vibrated like a living thing. Morrison released the brake, and 47 tons of steel began to move. They drove it to an empty field 2 kilometers away, well clear of any civilians or friendly position. Wickham had set up targets, old farm equipment and wooden frames positioned at various distances, 200 meters, 500, 1,000, 1,500. They stopped at 500 meters. Wickham traversed the turret manually, the Bofors swinging smoothly on its new mount. He put the sight on the nearest target, an old tractor body. His hand found the firing grip. Loader ready. Davies crouched behind him, hands on the ammunition hopper. Ready, sir. Firing. The Bofors spoke. Not the crack of a tank gun or the boom of artillery, but a rapid hammering that sounded like the world's largest typewriter. The recoil rocked the turret, but the reinforcements held. The gun fired in a continuous stream, the autoloader feeding rounds smoothly, spent casings, ejecting through a modified port in the turret side. The tractor exploded, not just hit, not just damaged, but torn apart by high explosive shells that detonated on impact. Metal fragments whirled through the air. The chassis flipped over. In 3 seconds, Wickham had put 30 rounds into the target. He released the trigger. The barrel steamed in the cool morning air. Smoke drifted across the field. Where the tractor had been, there was now just scattered wreckage and a shallow crater. Davies was laughing, a wild sound that echoed in the cramped turret. Did you see that? Did you bloody see that? Wickham traversed to the next target, a wooden frame, 800 meters away. He fired again. The Bofors hammered, the tracers streaking across the field like angry hornets. The frame disintegrated, splinters flying in every direction. He swung to the 1,000-meter target, fired. The shells walked across the field, tracers showing the path, each impact throwing up dirt and debris. The target simply ceased to exist. Morrison's voice crackled through the intercom. I don't know what you've built back there, but the Germans are going to shit themselves when they see it. Wickham didn't answer. He was already traversing to the 1,500-meter target, his hands steady on the controls, his mind calculating angles and lid times, and the 100 small factors that separated accurate fire from wasted ammunition. He fired. The distance made the tracers curve slightly, arcing across the field. The first burst fell short. He adjusted, raised the barrel a fraction, fired again. The target disappeared in a cloud of smoke and shredded wood. They expended 400 rounds that morning, testing the gun at every angle, every distance, every condition they could think of. The Bofors never jammed. The feed system never failed. The turret held together despite the continuous recoil. When they finally stopped, the barrel was hot enough to shimmer in the air. Wickham climbed out of the turret and jumped down from the deck. His ears were ringing despite the cotton wadding. His hands smelled like cordite. His uniform was soaked with sweat. He'd never felt better in his life.
Tobruk became a siege. Rommel surrounded the port in April and began a systematic assault that would last 8 months. Inside the perimeter, 25,000 British and Australian troops held a defensive line that stretched 35 kilometers, anchored by the old Italian fortifications and supplied by ships that ran the gauntlet from Alexandria. The Devil tanks became the backbone of Tobruk's air defense. 16 tanks, now reduced to 14 after combat losses, positioned around the perimeter to provide overlapping fields of fire against the Luftwaffe attacks that came daily. The Germans bombed the port, the supply dumps, the defensive positions, anything they could reach. And every time they came, the Bofors guns engaged. Wickham's crew had perfected their techniques through constant combat. They could identify aircraft by sound before they appeared. They knew the attack patterns, the approach angles, the tactics the Luftwaffe used. They'd developed a sixth sense for when an attack was coming. May 2nd, 1941. The Luftwaffe launched the largest raid yet, 47 aircraft, Stukas, Heinkel 111s, Junkers 88s. They came in waves, trying to overwhelm the defenses through sheer numbers. Wickham stood in his commander's cupola, watching the horizon, waiting. The first wave appeared at 1400 hours, 12 Stukas in V formation, diving on the harbour, where 2 British destroyers were unloading ammunition. All tanks, aircraft inbound, sector north, engage at will. The Bofors guns opened fire, filling the sky with tracers. The lead Stuka took hits and exploded in mid-air. The second pulled out of its dive, smoking heavily. The third released its bomb early, the 250-kilogram weapon falling harmlessly into the sea. The German pilots were learning. They'd started attacking from multiple directions simultaneously, forcing the Devil tanks to split their fire. Wickham traversed rapidly, engaging one target, switching to another, trying to cover as much sky as possible. His loader, a corporal named Jenkins who'd been with him since France, fed clips with mechanical precision, never missing a beat. The second wave came from the east, level bombers trying to hit the defensive position. Wickham engaged at maximum range, firing long bursts that forced the bombers to take evasive action. One Junkers 88 took a direct hit and cartwheeled into the desert, burning. The others dropped their bombs wild and fled. The third wave was the problem. 6 Stukas coming in low, under the effective range of most anti-aircraft fire, targeting individual tanks. Wickham saw them approaching, calculated quickly. They were too low for his maximum elevation. He'd have to depress the gun, engage them head-on as they closed. Driver, reverse slowly. I need more depression angle. The tank backed up, changing its position on the defensive berm, giving Wickham a better sight line. He put his crosshairs on the lead Stuka, now 300 meters out and closing fast. He fired. The Bofors shells walked up toward the diving aircraft, caught it at 150 meters. The Stuka exploded, pieces raining down across the desert. Wickham traversed, left, engaged the second aircraft, too close, too fast. The shells passed behind it. The Stuka released its bomb. Wickham saw it fall, a dark shape against the bright sky, dropping toward his tank. Time slowed. He could see every detail, the streamlined shape, the tail fins, the impact fuse on the nose. The bomb hit 20 meters in front of the Devil tank, exploded, threw up a massive geyser of sand and rock. The concussion wave hit like a physical blow, rocking the tank back on its suspension. Shrapnel pinged off the armor. Wickham's head slammed into the cupola rim, stars exploding across his vision. He shook it off, ignored the blood running down his face, traversed to the next target. The remaining Stukas pulled up, abandoning their attacks, fleeing west. Wickham tracked them, firing until they were out of range. Jenkins' voice came through the intercom, shaky. "Sir, you're bleeding." "I'm fine. Ammunition count. 32 rounds remaining in the hopper. We need to reload." "Do it." They'd expended 224 rounds in 6 minutes of combat. The desert tanks around the perimeter had collectively fired over 3,000 rounds, creating a wall of flak that destroyed 11 aircraft and damaged 18 others. The Luftwaffe withdrew, and Tobruk had survived another day. The siege continued through summer. The heat became unbearable, temperatures exceeding 50 degrees. Ammunition ran low, food ran low, water was rationed to 1 liter per man per day. The Devil tanks kept fighting. They engaged aircraft when the Luftwaffe attacked. They supported infantry during German ground assaults. They provided mobile fire support, moving between defensive positions, reinforcing weak points. Devil tank Alpha 3 was destroyed in June, when an 88mm anti-aircraft gun, used in the direct fire role, penetrated its side armor at close range. The crew escaped, but the tank burned for 2 days. Devil tank Alpha 9 broke down in July, transmission failure that couldn't be repaired with available parts.
It was stripped for spares and abandoned. Devil Tank Alpha 14 was hit by German artillery in August. A lucky shot that detonated the ammunition hopper. The explosion blew the turret completely off the hull. 2 crew members died instantly. By September, the heavy assault tank group was down to 11 operational tanks, but those 11 tanks had collectively destroyed 73 aircraft and damaged over 100 others. They'd broken up countless ground attacks. They'd held sections of the defensive line that should have fallen. General Morshead, commanding the Tobruk garrison, called Wickham to his headquarters in late September. The general looked exhausted, his uniform stained with sweat and dust, his face gaunt from months of limited rations. "Captain Wickham, I'm evacuating the heavy assault tank group." "Sir, we're still operational. We can keep fighting." "You've been fighting non-stop for 5 months. Your men are exhausted, your tanks are worn out, and frankly, I need the supply capacity more than I need the armor. Every ship that brings in parts for your tanks is a ship that could bring in food, water, ammunition for the infantry. The mathematics don't work anymore." Wickham wanted to argue, but he knew the general was right. The Devil tanks were valuable, but they were also resource-intensive. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, all shipped across the Mediterranean under German attack. "When do we leave?" "Tonight. HMS Defender is evacuating wounded and essential personnel. Your tanks will be loaded at the harbor after dark. The Luftwaffe has been bombing the loading areas, so expect opposition. We'll be ready." They moved to the harbor at 200 hours. 11 Devil tanks rolling through the ruins of Tobruk in the darkness. The town was a ghost of what it had been. Every building damaged, the streets cratered from bombs and shells. The harbor was lit only by fires still burning from the day's attack. HMS Defender sat alongside the dock, her crew working frantically to load wounded and equipment. Loading the tanks took 4 hours. Crane operations in darkness. Everyone working by feel and experience. German artillery started shelling the harbor at midnight. Shells screamed overhead, exploding in the water, throwing up columns of spray. The crew kept working. They got the last Devil tank aboard at 02:30 hours. HMS Defender cast off immediately, driving toward open water at flank speed. Wickham stood on the deck beside his tank, watching Tobruk recede into the darkness. 8 months. 8 months of constant combat, constant danger, living in a siege that had seemed impossible to survive, but they had survived. The Devil tanks had proven their worth in the most brutal test imaginable. The heavy assault tank group returned to England in October 1941. The surviving 11 Devil tanks loaded onto cargo ships and transported across the Mediterranean, through Gibraltar, up the Atlantic coast to Portsmouth. They arrived to a country that was slowly, painfully, learning how to win a war it had nearly lost. Wickham was promoted to major and given command of an expanded program. The success of the Devil tanks had convinced the War Office that the concept was sound, and production ramped up dramatically. By December, they had 40 Devil tanks operational. By March 1942, 73, but the world was changing. American production was accelerating, bringing new tank designs with better guns, better mobility, better everything. The Soviet Union was producing thousands of T-34s. Germany was fielding Tiger and Panther tanks with armor and firepower that made the old French Char B1 chassis obsolete. Despite the Bofors modification, Wickham saw the writing on the wall. The Devil tanks had been revolutionary in 1940, devastating in 1941, but by 1942 they were becoming outdated. The chassis was old French design from the 1930s. The mechanical systems, despite the upgrades, were temperamental. The fuel consumption was horrendous, and most critically, newer German tanks could penetrate the 60mm frontal armor that had once seemed invincible. The final deployment of Devil tanks in combat came in November 1942 during Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. 60 Devil tanks landed with British forces, providing air defense and fire support during the initial assaults. They performed well, destroying 23 aircraft and supporting multiple ground attacks. But after the landings, they were withdrawn from frontline service. The decision came from the top. Churchill himself had reviewed the reports, consulted with his generals, and made the call. The Devil tanks had served their purpose, but modern warfare required modern weapons.
Wickham received the orders in December. The heavy assault tank group would be disbanded. The Devil tanks would be retired from combat service. Some would be used for training, others would be scrapped for materials, a few would be preserved as historical artifacts. He stood in the motor pool at Bivington, looking at the rows of Devil tanks, their Bofors guns, silent, their armor scarred from combat. These machines had changed how Britain fought. They'd provided air defense when it was desperately needed. They'd broken Italian fortifications. They'd held Tobruk. They'd proven that engineering creativity and desperate necessity could create something remarkable. Morrison found him there, smoking a cigarette, looking old, despite being only 35. End of an era, Morrison said. Yes. What will you do now? Wickham pulled out the card Colonel Patterson had given him 2 years ago. He'd carried it through North Africa, through the siege, through everything. The Americans are interested in the concept. They're designing new tanks with integrated anti-aircraft capability. They want consultants who understand the theory and the practice. You're leaving the army. The war isn't over, but my part in it is. The Devil tanks were my war. Now they're history. Morrison nodded slowly. They'll remember, you know, years from now. People will study what we did. How we took abandoned French tanks and turned them into something the Germans feared. How we solved an impossible problem with available resources and determination. That matters. I hope so. They stood in silence, 2 engineers who'd spent 3 years building, modifying, fighting with machines that shouldn't have worked but did. The sun was setting, turning the Devon countryside golden. Somewhere in Europe, the war continued. Somewhere, men were fighting and dying. But here, in this motor pool, the Devil tanks rested. Their war was over. Wickham walked to the nearest tank, placed his hand on the armor. It was cold now, the metal no longer heated by combat or sun, just steel, shaped into purpose, scarred by use. He thought about the crews who'd fought in these machines, the drivers who'd learned to handle 47 tons of temperamental French engineering, the loaders who'd fed ammunition clips while under fire, the commanders who'd tracked targets through the Bofors sights and made decisions that meant life or death. Some of those men were dead now, some were wounded, some had been transferred to other units, other war, but they'd all been part of something unique, something that would never be repeated. The heavy assault tank group, officially disbanded on January 15th, the Devil tanks were dispersed to various fates. 27 were scrapped, the steel recycled into ships and aircraft. 18 were converted to training vehicles, used to teach new crews basic tank operation. 12 were sold to the Free French forces, who used them in secondary roles until war's end. 3 were preserved. 1 went to the Tank Museum at Bivington, where it would sit for decades, a monument to engineering creativity. 1 went to the Imperial War Museum in London, displayed alongside other artifacts of British innovation. The 3rd was given to France, a gesture of alliance, and placed in the Musée de Blandy, at Saumur. Wickham stayed in England long enough to oversee the disbandment, then took a ship to America in February. Colonel Patterson met him at the docks in New York, and they drove to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, where the U.S. Army was testing new tank designs. The Americans were enthusiastic, aggressive, convinced they could win the war through production and firepower. They showed Wickham their plans for the M4 Sherman, their designs for self-propelled guns, their concepts for the future of armored warfare, and they asked him questions. How had the Bofors gun performed? What were the limitations? How could the concept be improved? What lessons had been learned? Wickham answered truthfully. The Devil tanks had been effective because they combined heavy armor with rapid-fire anti-aircraft capability, but they'd been limited by their chassis, by their fuel consumption, by mechanical reliability issues. The future wasn't converting old tanks, it was designing new ones, with integrated systems from the start. The Americans listened, took notes, incorporated his feedback into their design. And years later, when historians studied the development of mobile anti-aircraft systems, they would trace the lineage back to a British lieutenant standing in a French field in 1940, looking at an abandoned tank and asking, what if? The war ended in Wickham returned to England, worked briefly as a civilian consultant for the Ministry of Supply, then retired to Devon. He bought a small house near Bivington,
close enough to visit the tank museum whenever he wanted. He went there often in his later years, standing in front of the preserved Devil tank, remembering the museum had done a good job with the display. They'd restored the tank to its combat configuration, the Bofors gun elevated as if searching for targets, the armor painted in desert camouflage. A placard explained the history, how British engineers had modified French tanks with Swedish guns to create a unique weapons platform, how these Devil tanks had fought in France, North Africa, and the Mediterranean, how they'd destroyed over 300 enemy aircraft and supported countless ground operations. But the placard couldn't capture everything. It couldn't describe the sound of the Bofors firing, the hammering roar that made your chest vibrate. It couldn't convey the feel of the tank moving beneath you, 47 tons of steel and purpose. It couldn't explain what it was like to stand in the commander's cupola under fire, tracking targets through the sight, making split-second decisions that determined who lived and who died. That knowledge belonged to the men who'd crewed the Devil tanks, and as the years passed, those men grew fewer. Wickham attended reunions when they were held, gatherings of old soldiers who'd shared something unique. They told stories, embellished probably, but containing essential truth. They remembered friends who hadn't survived. They honored the machines that had kept them alive. Morrison died in 1967, peacefully in his sleep, his wife holding his hand. Davies made it to 1974, lung cancer from years of welding fuel. Patterson, the American colonel, lived to 1981, long enough to see the U.S. Army deploy the M63 VADS, a modern descendant of the concept the Devil tanks had pioneered. Wickham outlived them all. He made it to 1989, 91 years old, his mind still sharp, his memories still vivid. He died on a Tuesday in November, sitting in his favorite chair, looking at a photograph from 1940. The photograph showed 12 Devil tanks, lined up at Bivington, their crews standing proudly beside them, young men who thought they were invincible because their tanks. The photograph captured a moment of hope, of innovation, of determination. The Tank Museum held a memorial service. Not many attended. Most of the Devil tank veterans were gone now, but those who came remembered. They stood in front of the preserved tank and shared stories. A grandson of one of the original crew members asked Wickham's daughter what her father had thought about the Devil tanks, whether he'd considered them successful. She smiled, remembering conversations from her childhood. He said they were necessary, not perfect, not ideal, but necessary. They solved the problem that existed in 1940, and that was enough. He said warfare isn't about perfect solutions, it's about making what you have work when everything is falling apart. The Devil tank still stands in the Bivington Museum today, a testament to engineering creativity, born from desperation. School children walk past it, barely glancing at the odd-looking tank with the strange gun. Military historians study it, analyzing the modifications, understanding the technical challenges. Veterans pause in front of it, reading the placard, imagining what it must have been like. The tank is silent now, has been for decades. The Bofors gun will never fire again. The engine will never start. The armor will never again deflect enemy shells. But it stands as proof of something important. When the world is falling apart, when defeat seems certain, when every reasonable option has failed, human creativity and determination can still create miracles. The Devil tanks were born in chaos, proven in combat, and retired with honor. They changed how the British Army thought about armored warfare. They saved lives, they won battles, and for the men who crewed them, who fought in them, who survived because of them, they were more than just machines. They were hope made of steel, desperation turned into purpose, impossibility transformed into reality. That legacy endures, preserved in museums, recorded in histories, remembered by fewer people each year. But as long as the Devil tank stands in Bivington scarred and silent and proud, the story remains, the story of what happens when you put 40mm Bofors guns on French Char B1 tanks, and the British call them Devil tanks, the story of engineering triumph in humanity's darkest hour, the story of 12 men in a French barn, who decided that surrender wasn't an option, and innovation was the only path forward. That story will always matter, that story will always be worth remembering.
They shipped to Alexandria in November, 16 Devil tanks loaded onto 3 cargo vessels, crossing the Mediterranean under heavy escort.
The Luftwaffe attacked twice, and both times the Devil tanks engaged from the ship's decks, their Bofors guns providing air defense for the entire convoy. They shot down 4 aircraft and damaged 6 others, without losing a single ship. North Africa was hell made of sand and heat. The temperature hit 40 degrees Celsius by midday. The tanks became ovens, the metal too hot to touch with bare hands. The crews learned to work in shifts, trading positions to avoid heat exhaustion. The sand got into everything, clogging filters, abrading bearings, scratching vision blocks until they were opaque. The Devil tanks arrived at the front lines in early December, assigned to support the Western Desert Forces' offensive against Italian positions around Sidi Barrani. Wickham stood in his command tank watching the Italian fortifications through binoculars, concrete bunkers, barbed wire, artillery positions. The Italians had been building these defenses for months. They looked formidable. The British attack began at dawn on December 9th. Artillery hammered the Italian positions for an hour. Then infantry advanced supported by light tanks. The Italians responded with machine gun fire and artillery. The British advance stalled. Wickham listened to the radio traffic, heard the frustration in the infantry commanders' voices. They needed the fortifications suppressed. They needed fire support. He called his tank commanders. "All Devil tanks, this is Lid. We're advancing to support the infantry. Target priority is bunkers and machine gun positions. Use the Bofors. Sustained fire. Walk your rounds onto target. Move out." 16 tanks rumbled forward, spreading into a line abreast formation. The Italian gunners saw them coming, shifted fire to the armor. Artillery shells landed among the Devil tanks, throwing up geysers of sand and rock. The tanks kept moving. At 800 meters, Wickham gave the order, "All tanks, engage at will." The Bofors guns opened fire simultaneously, a wall of 40mm shells hammering across the battlefield. The first Italian bunker exploded, as concentrated fire tore through the concrete. The second bunker lasted 10 seconds before the roof collapsed. Machine gun positions simply vanished, buried under high explosive detonations. The Italian artillery tried to target the Devil tanks, but the 47 tons of armor and 60mm frontal plates made them nearly invulnerable. Shells hit, bounced off, left nothing but dents and scratches. The tanks kept firing. Wickham worked the Bofors systematically, engaging targets in sequence, watching through the sight as his shells destroyed fortification after fortification. The rate of fire was devastating. Every burst was 20 rounds. Every 20 rounds destroyed something. Barbed wire obstacles exploded. Concrete walls crumbled. The Italian defenders broke and ran. Within 30 minutes, the entire defensive line was collapsing. British infantry surged forward through the gaps the Devil tanks had created, capturing positions, taking prisoners. The offensive that was supposed to take days succeeded in hours. By nightfall, Sidi Barrani had fallen. 5,000 Italian prisoners, 73 guns captured. The Western Desert Force had achieved the most decisive victory in the North African campaign so far, and the Devil tanks had been crucial to that success. General O'Connor, commanding the Western Desert Force, visited Wickham's position the next morning. He was a small man with hard eyes and a reputation for aggressive tactics. "Lieutenant Wickham," he said, returning Wickham's salute, "your tanks performed admirably yesterday. Thank you, sir. I'm promoting you to captain and giving you operational command of the heavy assault tank group. You'll report directly to my staff and provide fire support wherever needed. The Italians are retreating toward Bardi. I intend to pursue aggressively. I'll need your tanks at the front." "We'll be ready, sir." O'Connor studied the nearest Devil tank, walking around it slowly. "These are remarkable machines. How many more can we get?" "Production is ramping up in England, sir. We should receive another 8 tanks by February, bringing the total to 24. Not enough. We need hundreds of these, but we'll make do with what we have." He turned to leave, then paused. "Captain, the Italians are easy opponents, poorly led, poorly equipped, poor morale, but the Germans are coming. Rommel is bringing the Afrika Korps, and they won't break as easily. When they arrive, your tanks will face real opposition. Be ready." The general was right. The Germans arrived in March 1941, and everything changed. Rommel brought Panzer IIIs, and Panzer IVs, experienced crews who'd fought in France and Poland. He brought 88mm anti-aircraft guns that could destroy any tank at extreme range. He brought aggressive tactics and brilliant leadership. The first encounter happened near Tobruk in April. Wickham's Devil tanks were supporting an Australian infantry brigade when German armour appeared on the northern flank. 8 Panzer IIIs, moving fast, trying to outmaneuver the British line. Wickham ordered his tanks into a defensive formation, hull down behind a ridge, only the turrets visible. When the German tanks came into range, he held fire, letting them close. 1,500 meters, 1,800, all tanks, engage armor. The Bofors guns hammered, but the 40mm shells were designed for anti-aircraft work, not armor penetration. Against the Panzer III's 50mm frontal armor, they were ineffective at long range. The German tanks returned fire. Their 50mm guns could penetrate the Devil tank's side armor, but the frontal armor held. Shells sparked off the glacis plates, ricocheted into the sky. Wickham ordered the tanks to use their hull-mounted 75mm guns. At 800 meters, the French guns could penetrate German armor. The battle devolved into a slugging match, both sides firing as fast as they could load. 2 Panzer IIIs exploded, a third caught fire, but Devil tank Alpha 12 took a hit that penetrated the side armor, killing the driver. The tank was immobilized but still fighting, the turret continuing to engage. Wickham switched tactics. Instead of trying to penetrate frontal armor with the Bofors, he targeted vision blocks, optics, external equipment. The high rate of fire meant he could pepper a German tank continuously, blinding it, destroying its external fittings, making it impossible to fight effectively. A Panzer III, its vision blocks shattered and periscopes destroyed, tried to retreat blind and drove into a ditch. Another, its radio antenna shot away, and commander's cupola damaged, lost contact with its unit, and withdrew. The remaining 3 German tanks retreated after losing half their force. Wickham didn't pursue. His mission was to support the infantry, not chase German armor across the desert. But the engagement had shown the Devil tank's limitations. Against heavy armor, the Bofors gun wasn't enough. They needed the 75mm hull gun to actually destroy tanks, and that gun required the entire vehicle to aim. It was awkward, slow, less effective than a proper turret-mounted anti-tank gun. The Devil tanks were still revolutionary, still effective, but they weren't invincible. Rommel was proving.
Word spread fast through the British lines. An experimental tank, they said. Something the engineers had cooked up. Officers started appearing, wanting to see it, wanting to understand what Wickham's team had created. By the second week, they'd conducted 17 separate demonstrations for everyone from battalion commanders to a skeptical brigadier who'd fought tanks at Cambrai in the last war and thought he'd seen everything. The demonstrations followed the same pattern. Wickham would position the Char B1 at 500 meters from a target array. He'd traverse the turret, showing how smoothly the Bofors moved, despite its size. Then he'd fire, and whatever doubts the observers had would vanish in the thunder of 40mm shells tearing down range at 200 rounds per minute. The brigadier, a man named Hawksworth with a handlebar mustache and a chest full of medals, watched through binoculars as Wickham reduced 3 separate targets to scrap metal in under a minute. He lowered the binoculars slowly. "Good God," he said, "what's the ammunition capacity?" 256 rounds in the internal hopper, Wickham replied. "We can reload from external ammunition storage, but the hopper provides continuous fire for approximately 90 seconds at maximum rate, and the armor, unchanged from the original French specification, 60mm frontal, 40 on the sides. Nothing the Germans currently field can penetrate it at combat ranges." Hawksworth walked around the tank slowly, his boots crunching on spent brass casings. He examined the Bofors mount, the reinforced turret ring, the modified hull. "How many of these can you build?" Wickham had been waiting for that question. "We've located 47 Char B1 tanks abandoned across northern France. Most were left behind due to fuel shortages or minor mechanical issues. We have enough Bofors guns in theater to convert 12 tanks immediately, with more available if we divert them from coastal defense positions, and crew training."
The driver position is unchanged. The commander and loader need specialized training on the Bofors system, approximately 40 hours. The gunner position is simpler than the original French setup, because the Bofors has better sights and easier controls. Hawksworth was quiet for a long moment, staring at the tank. The French are going to capitulate, he said finally. Maybe days, maybe weeks, but it's coming. When they do, these tanks become spoils of war. German spoils, unless we get them out first. Yes, you're proposing we steal French tanks, modify them with Swedish guns, and use them against the Germans who are about to capture them anyway. That's an accurate summary, sir. Hawksworth smiled, a thin expression that made him look dangerous. I'll have the authorization paperwork on your desk by tomorrow morning. You have 3 weeks to convert as many tanks as possible before we evacuate. After that, you'll take them back to Undland and create a proper training program. He turned to leave, then, what are you calling this monstrosity? Wickham hadn't thought about that. The French designation was Char B1, battle tank, but this wasn't a French tank anymore. It was something new, something the original designers had never imagined. The French called them breakthrough tanks, he said, heavy assault vehicles. The Germans have been calling them. He paused, remembering an intercepted radio transmission they'd decoded last week, a German tank commander reporting contact with French armor, his voice tight with fear. The Germans have been calling them devil tanks, sir, because they can't kill them. Hawksworth nodded slowly. Devil tank it is then. Appropriate. He left and Wickham watched him go, knowing that everything had just changed. What had started as a field modification, an engineering experiment born from desperation and available resources, was about to become an official program. They had 3 weeks to find 47 abandoned French tanks scattered across a country that was actively collapsing, recover them, transport them to secure locations, strip out the original armament, install Bofors guns, test the modifications, and train crews to use them. It was impossible, which meant they'd have to do it anyway. Morrison appeared at his elbow. Did I hear that right? We're going tank hunting across France while the Germans are chasing us back to the coast. That's the general idea. We'll need more men, more equipment, more fuel than currently exists in the entire British Expeditionary Force. I know. The Germans are between us and most of those abandoned tanks. I know that too. Morrison lit a cigarette, took a long drag, exhaled slowly. When do we start? Wickham checked his watch. It was 14:30 hours on a Thursday afternoon. In 72 hours the Germans would take our ass. In a week they'd be pushing toward the Channel ports. Every hour mattered now. We start immediately, he said. They split into 3 teams. Wickham took the eastern sector, searching the fields and forests around Stonner, where the French 3rd Armoured Division had fought its desperate last stand. Morrison went north toward Valenciennes, where intelligence reported at least 15 abandoned tanks. Davies got the southern route, down through the Ardennes, where the Germans had broken through. Each team had trucks, recovery equipment, and authorization papers that probably wouldn't matter if they encountered German forces, but might convince confused French units to let them haul away the heavy armor. Wickham's team found the first tank on their second day out. It sat in a farmyard, surrounded by chickens and mud, looking like a monument to a war that was still being lost. The farmer came out, an old man with a wine-stained mustache and eyes that had seen too much. "You're taking it?" he asked in Wickham's French was mediocre, but he managed. "Yes, we're taking it to fight." The old man nodded. "Good." The crew, they walked away crying because they had to leave it. They said it was the best tank in the world, but they had no fuel, no ammunition, no orders, just told to retreat. He spat in the mud. Retreat, always retreat. They hitched the Char B1 to a heavy recovery vehicle, a 6-wheel drive Scammo, that groaned under the load but managed to pull the 47 tons. The convoy headed back to their workshop, now relocated to a warehouse outside Bethel. By the end of the first week they had 7 tanks. By the end of the second week 19. The Germans were getting closer. They could hear the artillery at night, distant thunder that rolled across the countryside like the footsteps of giants. Refugees clogged the roads, making movement difficult. Twice they had to detour around German reconnaissance units, hiding the massive recovery vehicles and tanks in tree lines until the enemy passed. The roads were chaos, 3 million refugees moving west,
clogging every route, every pathway, every farm track that might lead away from the advancing Germans. Wickham's convoy crawled through the human tide at walking speed, the recovery vehicles groaning under the weight of the Char B1 tanks they were hauling. It was 0200 hours on a moonless night, and the world had gone mad. A woman with a baby pressed against the side of Wickham's truck, her face pale in the darkness, eyes empty of everything except the need to keep moving. An old man pulled a handcart, piled with belongings that probably represented his entire life. Children cried, horses whinnied in fear. Somewhere ahead, a vehicle had broken down, and the entire column had stopped. Wickham climbed out of the cab, walked forward to investigate. A French army truck sat sideways across the road, its engine smoking, the driver nowhere to be seen. Civilian vehicles were backed up behind it for 100 meters. More were arriving every minute. Nobody was in charge. Nobody was directing traffic. Everyone just wanted to move, to escape, to get away from the Germans who were less than 20 kilometers behind them now. Davies appeared beside him, breathing hard. "Sir, we need to clear this. The Germans have been pushing reconnaissance units ahead. If they catch us here, with the tanks loaded on transporters, we're done." Wickham looked at the truck. It was a 5-tonner, probably weighed 7,000 kilograms loaded. The Char B1 they were towing weighed 47,000. He walked back to the lead recovery vehicle, climbed onto the running board, leaned in through the window. "Ram it," he told the driver. The driver, a Londoner named Phillips with grease permanently embedded under his fingernails, grinned. "Yes, sir." The Scammell recovery vehicle had been designed to pull disabled tanks off battlefields. It had a Meadows 6-cylinder engine producing 102 horsepower, and a frame built from steel channel that could withstand forces that would crumple ordinary trucks. Phillips engaged the gears, released the brake, and the Scammell lurched forward. The bumper hit the French truck with a sound like a church bell being struck by a sledgehammer. The truck slid sideways, tires screeching, then toppled into the ditch. The road was clear. The convoy started moving again, and Wickham felt no guilt whatsoever. They reached Bethune at dawn, exhausted, running on coffee and cigarettes and the knowledge that every hour counted. The warehouse had been transformed into a production line. 5 tanks in various stages of conversion sat in neat rows. Welders worked in shifts around the clock. The smell of hot metal and ozone filled the air. Morrison was waiting, his face haggard, uniform covered in soot. "The Germans took Cahr," he said without preamble. "Calais is under siege. The BF is falling back to Dunkirk." Wickham felt his stomach drop. "How long do we have?" "Days, maybe a week if we're lucky. The Admiralty is organizing an evacuation. Every ship in England is being sent across the channel." "What about the tanks?" Morrison gestured at the warehouse. "We've got 12 fully converted, another 5 in progress. The rest," he shrugged. "The rest are still scattered across France, and we're out of time to get them. 12 tanks. 12 devil tanks. Not the fleet Wickham had imagined, but enough to prove the concept, enough to show what was possible. "We need to get these 12 to Dunkirk," Wickham said. "We need to get them onto ships before the Germans close the pocket. The roads are impassable. You've seen it. Refugees everywhere. French army units in full retreat. No order, no control. Moving 12 47-ton tanks, 70 kilometers through that." Morrison shook his head. "It's impossible." "Then we drive them." Morrison stared at him. "You want to drive 12 experimental tanks, operated by crews with minimal training, through 70 kilometers of chaos, in enemy-controlled territory, to reach a port that's currently being bombed by the Luftwaffe?" "Yeah, you're insane." "Probably," Wickham agreed. "But can you think of a better option?" Morrison couldn't, which was answer enough. They assembled the crews that afternoon. 12 drivers who'd trained on the Char B1's complicated controls, 12 commanders who'd learned the Bofors system, 12 loaders who could feed ammunition while crouched in a cramped turret under fire, 36 men total, most of them mechanics and engineers, none of them trained as combat tankers. Wickham stood before them in the warehouse, the incomplete tanks looming behind him like sleeping giants. "Tomorrow at dawn," he said, "we're going to drive these tanks to Dunkirk. It's 70 kilometers through territory that may or may not be occupied by German forces. The roads are clogged with refugees.
The Luftwaffe controls the sky. Our orders are to reach the port, load the tanks onto ships, and get them back to England. He paused. Let that sink in. I won't lie to you, this is dangerous. The tanks are heavy, slow, and drink fuel like nothing you've ever seen. If we break down, we'll be captured or destroyed. If we encounter German armor, we'll have to fight with weapons we've barely tested, and tactics we're making up as we go. A hand went up. Private Cooper, one of the drivers, barely 20 years old. Sir, what happens if we don't make it? Then the devil tanks die in France, Wickham said simply. And all of this work, all of this effort, means nothing. The Germans will find the abandoned tanks, study them, maybe even copy the design. Everything we've done will benefit the enemy. He looked at each man in turn. But if we do make it, if we get these tanks onto ships and back to England, we'll have created something new, a weapon the Germans fear, a weapon that can't be killed by anything they currently field, a weapon that might help us win this war. Nobody spoke. The warehouse was quiet except for the distant sound of artillery and the hum of welding equipment. Finally, Davies stepped forward. When do we leave, sir? Dawn. Be ready. They worked through the night making final adjustments, loading ammunition, filling fuel tanks with every liter they could scavenge. Wickham walked among the tanks, checking connections, testing systems, making sure everything was as ready as it could be. The Char B1s sat in their row like sleeping dragons, the Bofors guns jutting from their turrets, the armor plates painted in hastily applied camouflage. They weren't pretty, they weren't elegant, but they were functional, and right now, functionality was all that mattered. At 0500 hours, the crews mounted up, engines coughed to life one by one, filling the warehouse with noise and smoke. Wickham climbed into the lead tank, took his position behind the Bofors gun. The leather padding was worn smooth from testing. The controls felt familiar in his hand. Morrison's voice crackled through the intercom. Ready to move on your order. Wickham took a deep breath. All tanks. This is lead. We move in column formation, 50-meter spacing. Maintain visual contact with the vehicle ahead. If anyone breaks down, the next tank in line stops to assist. We don't leave anyone behind. Acknowledgements came back, one by one. 12 tank commanders, 12 voices, 12 promises. Move out.
The convoy left Bethune as the sun broke the horizon, 12 devil tanks moving in formation down the main road toward the coast. The ground shook under their combined weight, 564 tons of steel and machinery grinding forward at 15 kilometers per hour. Wickham rode in the commander's cupola, exposed to the elements, watching the landscape roll past. The French countryside was burning, not everywhere, not continuously, but in patches across the horizon, where German artillery had found targets or where fuel dumps had been destroyed to keep them from enemy hands. Smoke columns rose into the morning sky like dark pillars holding up the clouds. The road was bad but not impassable. The refugees had mostly moved off the pavement when they heard the tanks coming, pressing into ditches and fields, watching with hollow eyes as the massive vehicles rumbled past. Some waved, most just stared. They passed a French army unit in full retreat, soldiers walking with their rifles slung, no officers visible, no organization. They looked defeated in a way that had nothing to do with combat. These were men whose country was dying around them, whose leaders had failed them, whose allies were evacuating. A sergeant stood by the roadside watching the tanks pass. He saluted, a sharp, precise gesture that looked absurd in the chaos. Wickham returned it. 10 kilometers out, the first breakdown occurred. Tank 7, the one commanded by Lieutenant Shaw, lurched to a stop with white smoke pouring from the engine compartment. The column halted. Wickham climbed down from his tank and ran back. Shaw was already out, pulling engine panels off, with Davies helping. Fuel line rupture, Davies announced after 30 seconds of inspection. The French used rubber hoses that are degrading. We can patch it, but it'll take an hour. We don't have an hour. Then we abandon the tank. Wickham looked at the Char B1. They'd spent a week converting it. It represented thousands of hours of work. The Bofors gun alone was worth more than most soldiers earned in a year. Can you make it mobile enough to tow? Davies considered. Maybe. If we bypass the fuel pump and gravity feed directly to the engine, it'll run rough, but it'll run. Do it. 15 minutes. They did it in 12. Tank 7 limped back into formation. black smoke coughing from the exhaust, but moving. The convoy started again. 20 kilometers from Bethune, they encountered their first German patrol. Wickham spotted them first. A pair of Das 22 armored cars cresting a hill ahead, the distinctive German grey paint visible, even at distance. He grabbed the intercom. All tanks, enemy contact. Fronded cars, probably reconnaissance. Hold formation. The German vehicles stopped when they saw the column. Wickham could imagine the radio conversation happening right now. The German commander reporting 12 heavy tanks moving toward the coast. Maybe they thought they were French. Maybe they recognized the British modifications. It didn't matter. The lead German vehicle's turret began to traverse, the 20mm autocannon swinging toward the British column. Wickham's hands found the Bofors controls. Loader, stand by. Davies fed a clip into the hopper. Ready. The German armored car fired first, the 20mm shells cracking across the distance, sparking harmlessly off the Char B1's frontal armor. Wickham barely felt the impacts. He put the sight on the lead vehicle, waited for the range to close. 500 meters, 400, 300. He fired. The Bofors hammered, tracers streaking across the morning air. The German armored car exploded. Not a single penetration followed by fire, but a catastrophic detonation, as multiple 40mm shells punched through the thin armor and detonated inside. The vehicle lifted off the ground, flipped sideways, came down as burning wreckage. The second armored car tried to retreat. Wickham traversed smoothly, leading the target, and fired again. The Bofors shells caught it broadside, tearing through the armor like paper. The vehicle careened off the road and crashed into a ditch, flames billowing. Total engagement time, 8 seconds. Total ammunition expended, 40 rounds. Total enemy vehicles destroyed, 2. All tanks continue advance. Wickham ordered. They rolled past the burning wrecks and he saw the German crewmen who'd escaped, running across the fields, not looking back. He didn't fire. They weren't a threat anymore. 30 kilometers out, the Luftwaffe found them. Wickham heard them before he saw them. The distinctive growl of Junkers 87 Stuka dive bombers. He looked up, spotted 3 aircraft circling at altitude, their gull wings unmistakable. All tanks, aircraft inbound. Commanders, prepare to engage. The lead Stuka rolled into its dive, the scream of its siren cutting through the engine noise. It was targeting the rear of the column, probably assuming the last tank would be the weakest. Wrong assumption. Wickham watched Tank 12's turret traverse, following the diving aircraft. The Bofors opened fire, tracers arcing up, creating a cone of flak that the Stuka had to fly through. The German pilot held steady, committed to the attack. Bad decision. The 40mm shells caught the Stuka at 400 meters altitude. The aircraft staggered, pieces flying off the wings. Then the fuel tanks ignited. It cartwheeled across the sky, trailing fire, and crashed into a field 200 meters away. The other 2 Stukas broke off their attacks, climbing hard, abandoning their run. Wickham didn't blame them. Diving on tanks that could throw up that much anti-aircraft fire was suicide. The column kept moving, 40 kilometers to Dunkirk, 40 kilometers through enemy territory, through chaos, through a country that was dying. They passed more refugees, more retreating French units, more burning vehicles. They passed British units too, infantry, marching toward the coast, medical convoys, supply trucks. Everyone was heading the same direction now, toward the sea, toward evacuation, toward survival. At 50 kilometers they ran into a roadblock, not German, but British. A major stood in the middle of the road, with a platoon of infantry, rifles ready. Wickham ordered the column to halt, climbed down, walked forward. This road is closed, the major said. His uniform was torn, his face exhausted. No unauthorized vehicles are allowed toward Dunkirk. The port is at capacity. We're authorized, Wickham said, pulling out his papers. The major barely looked at them. I don't care what your papers say. I have orders to prevent any additional vehicles from clogging the evacuation routes. These aren't vehicles, Wickham said quietly. They're weapons. Weapons that need to get back to England. Everyone needs to get back to England. Everyone has reason. I have a field hospital behind me with 200 wounded men who need evacuation.
They take priority over your bloody tanks. Wickham understood. The major was exhausted, overwhelmed, trying to maintain order in a situation that had no order. He was following his orders, doing his duty. But Wickham had orders too. Major, he said carefully, I understand your position, but these tanks represent something important. They represent a weapon that can kill German aircraft, German armor, German infantry. They represent hope that we can fight back, that we can. If we lose them here, we lose more than just 12 tanks. We lose the future. The major was quiet for a long moment. Then he stepped aside. Go, but if you block the route, if you cause any delay to the medical convoys, I'll personally put a round through your head. Understood? They moved forward, and Wickham could feel the weight of every decision pressing down on him. The convoy reached Dunkirk at dusk on their second day of travel. The port was chaos elevated to an art form, ships burning in the harbor, bombs falling, thousands of men queued on the beaches waiting for boats, smoke so thick it turned day into twilight. Wickham found the port commandant, a navy captain who looked like he hadn't slept in days. 12 tanks, the captain said flatly when Wickham explained. You want me to load 12 tanks onto ships designed for personnel transport? Yes, each tank weighs 47 tons. The captain laughed, a sound with no humor in it. We're loading men by the thousand. We're using fishing boats, pleasure craft, anything that floats. And you want me to dedicate cargo space to tanks? These aren't normal tanks. Wickham gestured at the nearest devil tank. These are weapons that can change how we fight. They need to get to England. The captain studied the Char B1, walked around it, examined the Bofors map. His expression shifted from annoyance to interest. That's a Bofors gun. Yes. On a French heavy tank. Yes. Who authorized this modification? Brigadier Hawksworth. I have the paperwork. The captain waved away the papers. I don't care about paperwork. I care about capability. Can that gun engage aircraft? We've already destroyed one stop. The crews are trained and ready. The captain was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he pointed across the harbor. HMS Javelin, destroyer, currently loading wounded and essential personnel. Her captain is Commander Pugsley. Good man, understands the value of anti-aircraft capability. I'll contact him, see if he can take one tank. The other 11 will have to wait for cargo vessels. Might be days. I'll take what I can get, then get your tank to the dock. You have 2 hours before Javelin departs.
Loading a 47-ton tank onto a destroyer designed to displace only 1,060 tons was engineering madness. The dock crane groaned under the weight, cables singing with tension as the Char B1 slowly lifted off the ground. Wickham stood on the dock watching, his heart in his throat, certain that at any moment something would snap and the devil tank would crash down, and that would be the end of everything. The crane operator was a civilian, an old Frenchman who'd worked the Dunkirk docks for 40 years. He handled the controls like a concert pianist, making tiny adjustments, keeping the load stable as it swung over the water toward HMS Javelin's deck. Commander Pugsley stood on the destroyer's bridge, watching the operation with the expression of a man who'd been asked to catch a falling piano. His ship was 33 feet long with a beam of only 33 feet. The tank was nearly 20 feet long, 10 feet wide, and weighed more than 3 of his main guns combined. If the weight distribution was wrong, if the tank shifted during transit, the destroyer could capsize. The crane lowered the Char B1 onto the deck. Just aft of the forward gun turret, sailors rushed forward with chains and securing points, lashing the tank down with everything they had. Davies supervised, checking each connection, making sure the devil tank wouldn't move even if the ship rolled in heavy seas. Pugsley came down from the bridge, walked around the tank slowly, his hands behind his back. He stopped in front of Wickham. This tank better be worth it, he said. Sir, with respect, that tank can put 200 rounds per minute into any aircraft within 2,000 meters. If the Luftwaffe attacks during transit, you'll want it operational. Then I expect you to crew it. You'll be the only anti-aircraft capability I have, beyond small arms. Yes. Pugsley nodded curtly and walked away, already shouting orders to cast off. Wickham climbed onto the tank and dropped through the commander's hatch. The interior smelled like fuel and metal, and the particular funk of a vehicle that had been pushed hard for 2 days straight. Davies was already in the loader's position, checking the ammunition hopper.
We've got 64 rounds loaded, sir. Another 192 in storage bins. Should be enough if the Jerrys come calling. It'll have to. The destroyer's engines thrummed to life, vibration running through the hull. Wickham felt the ship begin to move, backing away from the dock, turning toward the channel. He climbed back up, stood in the commander's cupola, watched Dunkirk recede into the smoke and haze. The beaches were packed with men, thousands of them waiting in lines that stretched into the sea. Boats ferried them out to larger ships. The whole operation was visible chaos held together by British stubbornness and naval efficiency, a miracle in progress. The sun was setting, turning the smoke orange and red, beautiful in the way that disasters can be beautiful, if you're far enough away. HMS Javelin cleared the harbour and picked up speed, driving west toward England at 20 knots, the crew secured for action station. Pugsley's voice came over the ship's address system. All hands, we are now in contested waters. German E-boats and aircraft are active. Maintain vigilance. Gun crews to stations. Wickham traversed the Bofors, checking the mechanism, making sure everything was ready. The destroyer's deck was cramped, the turret barely clearing the forward gun mount. The tank was secured with chains that wouldn't allow traverse beyond 60 degrees to either side, meaning he had a limited arc of fire, better than nothing. The Luftwaffe found them 20 minutes later. Wickham heard the engines first, that distinctive German drone. He looked up, spotted them against the darkening sky. 9 aircraft flying in 3-ship formations. Heinkel 11 bombers, coming in low over the water. Aircraft inbound, bearing 045. Someone shouted from the bridge. The destroyer's 4.7-inch guns couldn't depress low enough to engage aircraft at this range. The Oerlikon guns wouldn't be effective until the bombers were much closer, but the Bofors could reach them now. Wickham put the lead aircraft in his sights, calculated the lead angle, waited for the range to close. 1,500 meters, 1,400, 1,300, 1,300. He fired. The Bofors hammered, tracers arcing across the twilight. The first burst fell short, splashing into the sea. He adjusted, raised the barrel slightly, fired again. The shells walked up toward the lead Heinkel, and then they hit. The bomber staggered, one engine exploding, black smoke streaming. It rolled left, out of formation, lost altitude, crashed into the channel in a spray of white water. The other 8 bombers scattered, breaking formation, climbing for altitude. Wickham traversed, leading the second aircraft, firing in controlled bursts. The Bofors shells tore through the Heinkel's wing, and the aircraft simply came apart, pieces tumbling through the air. The remaining bombers dropped their payloads early, bombs splashing into the sea, hundreds of meters away, and fled back toward France. Total engagement time, 90 seconds. Total ammunition expended, 106 rounds. Total enemy aircraft destroyed, 2. Total enemy aircraft driven off without attacking, 6. Pugsley appeared on the deck below, looking up at Wickham with an expression that might have been respect. That, he said, was extraordinary shooting. The gun does most of the work. The gun doesn't calculate lead angles or track moving targets. That was skill. He paused. We have 4 more hours to England. If the Luftwaffe comes back, can you do that again? As long as we have ammunition. Good, because they will come back. They always do. Pugsley was right. The Luftwaffe returned twice more during the crossing. The second attack was 5 Junkers 88s, trying to bomb from altitude. Wickham drove them off with sustained fire that didn't hit anything but made the pilots think twice about flying straight and level. The third attack was the serious one. 12 Sturkers at dusk, diving in pairs, trying to overwhelm the destroyer's defenses. Wickham destroyed the first one on its dive, the second as it pulled up, and damaged a third badly enough that it trailed smoke all the way back to France. The other 9 broke off their attacks and fled. HMS Javelin reached Portsmouth at neo 200 hours, escorted by 2 British destroyers that had come out to meet them. The harbour was blacked out, only guide lights marking the approach channel. The destroyer edged up to the dock carefully, the tank on its deck making the ship handle strangely. Wickham stayed in the commander's position until the ship was secured, then climbed down. His legs nearly gave out when he hit the dock. He'd been standing in the cupola for 6 hours straight. hadn't eaten since dawn, hadn't slept in 2 days. Davies caught his arm. Easy, sir. You're on solid ground now. Solid ground. England. Home. They'd made it. Pugsley came down the gangway, walking stiffly, exhausted. He stopped in front of Wickham, extended his hand. Lieutenant, that tank of yours saved my ship. If you ever need a favor from the Royal Navy, you've earned it. They shook hands, and Wickham felt the weight of everything hitting him at once. The exhaustion, the fear, the impossible journey from a French barn to an English dock. What happens to the other 11 tanks? Pugsley asked. Still in Dunkirk, waiting for cargo ships. They'll get out. Might take days, might take a week, but they'll get out. The Navy doesn't leave assets behind if we can help it. Wickham hoped he was right. They'd built 12 Devil tanks, proved the concept, shown that the impossible could be made real through engineering and determination. Losing 11 of them to German capture would be devastating. A staff car appeared, headlights dimmed to slits. An officer climbed out, captain's insignia on his collar, papers in his hand. Lieutenant Wickham, I'm Captain Harrison, War Officer. I'm here to take custody of your tank and brief you on next steps. Next steps, sir? You've created something remarkable. Brigadier Hawksworth's report made that clear. The Prime Minister himself has read. You're being transferred to a new unit, one dedicated to developing and deploying these Devil tanks. We're calling it the Heavy Assault Tank Group, and you're going to run